The dust from the stagecoach had barely settled on Main Street when Grace Jenkins collapsed in front of Willow Creek's only mercantile, her body convulsing violently against the rough-hewn boardwalk, drawing gasps from onlookers who quickly backed away as if she carried the plague. The year was 1875, and epilepsy was still widely misunderstood, often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment for sins unknown. Wade Young had been loading supplies into his wagon when he heard the commotion. Unlike the others who stood at a distance whispering behind their hands, he rushed toward the fallen woman. He'd seen seizures before during his time in the Union Army and knew enough not to restrain her or force anything into her mouth, myths that persisted even among educated folk. Wade knelt beside her, removing his duster and folding it gently beneath her head. He spoke calmly, though he knew she likely couldn't hear him. "You're all right, miss. Just breathe through it. It'll pass." The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the seizure subsided and the young woman's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to mortification as she realized what had happened. Wade helped her sit up slowly, keeping a steady hand on her back. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I thought I had more time to find lodging before." She gestured weakly, unable to finish her sentence. "No need for apologies, miss. Can I help you to the doctor or hotel?" She shook her head firmly. "No doctor. I've seen enough of them to last a lifetime." Her voice, though quiet, carried a determination that Wade instantly respected. "The hotel would be fine if they'll have me." "They will," Wade replied with more confidence than he felt. Willow Creek wasn't known for its hospitality toward those considered different. He helped her to her feet, gathering her modest carpetbag that had fallen nearby. As they walked slowly toward the hotel, she stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "I should warn you, I have epilepsy. I'm dangerous, at least that's what people say. You shouldn't waste your kindness on me." Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze remained steady. Wade looked into her eyes, hazel with flecks of gold that caught the afternoon sunlight, and offered a small smile. "I don't put much stock in what people say, Mississippi. Jenkins. Grace Jenkins. Wade Young." He tipped his hat slightly. "And I don't see anything dangerous about you, Miss Jenkins, except perhaps those sharp eyes of yours that seem to see right through a man's bluster." A tentative smile curved her lips, the first he'd seen since she regained consciousness. "Most people run in the opposite direction once they know." "I'm not most people," Wade replied simply, "and I've weathered enough storms in my life to know that sometimes the darkest clouds bring the most needed rain." Wade secured Grace a room at the Willow Creek Hotel despite the proprietor's obvious hesitation. He paid for 3 nights in advance, ignoring the older man's warning that he wouldn't be responsible for any damages or disturbances. "I'll return in the morning to check on you," Wade told Grace at her door. "Get some rest." She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Why are you helping me?" It was a fair question, one Wade wasn't entirely sure how to answer. "Because everyone deserves a helping hand sometimes," he finally said. "Even stubborn cowboys like me." That night, lying in his bed at the small cabin he'd built on the outskirts of town, Wade found himself unable to sleep. His thoughts kept returning to Grace Jenkins, her vulnerability mingled with fierce independence, the way she'd warned him away as if to protect him rather than herself. In his 32 years, he'd rarely met anyone who intrigued him so quickly. Morning came with a gentle rain that washed the dust from the streets of Willow Creek. Wade finished his chores earlier than usual, feeding his horses and mending a broken fence post before riding into town. He stopped at Mabel's bakery for fresh bread and pastries, earning a raised eyebrow from Mabel herself. "Special occasion, Wade? Don't often see you splurging on sweet things." "Just being neighborly," he replied noncommittally, avoiding her curious gaze. At the hotel, Wade knocked gently on Grace's door, half expecting her to have left town already. To his surprise, she answered promptly, dressed in a simple blue calico dress, her chestnut hair neatly braided and wrapped around her head like a crown. Without the haze of a seizure or the dust of travel, Wade could see she was striking, not conventionally beautiful perhaps, but with a strength in her features that drew the eye. "Mr. Young," she said, clearly surprised. "I didn't expect you to actually come." "I'm a man of my word, Miss Jenkins." He held up the package from the bakery. "Thought you might enjoy breakfast. Mabel makes the best cinnamon rolls west of the Mississippi." Grace hesitated before opening the door wider. "I suppose it would be rude to refuse such generosity." They sat at the small table near the window, the morning light casting soft shadows across the room. Grace ate slowly, methodically, as if savoring each bite. Wade noticed her hands trembled slightly, but she managed the food with practiced grace. "May I ask what brings you to Willow Creek?" Wade inquired after they'd eaten in companionable silence for several minutes. "It's not exactly on the main route west." Grace dabbed her lips with a handkerchief before answering. "I'm looking for work. I'm a seamstress by trade, though I can do other things: cooking, cleaning, basic bookkeeping." Her chin lifted slightly, a defensive gesture. "I'm quite capable between episodes." Wade nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Whitfield at the dress shop might need help. Her eyesight isn't what it used to be, and her daughter just married and moved to Sacramento." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But Willow Creek can be set in its ways. People might not be understanding about your condition." A bitter smile crossed Grace's face. "No town is understanding, Mr. Young. I've been moving westward for 3 years, never staying anywhere longer than a few months once they discover what I am." She looked down at her hands. "But I'm running out of west to run to." Something in her words squeezed Wade's heart. "What if you didn't have to run this time?" Grace looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you had someone willing to stand beside you, to help others understand that epilepsy doesn't make you dangerous or incapable?" "That's a nice sentiment, Mr. Young, but—" "Wade," he interrupted gently. "Wade," she amended. "But sentiment doesn't change facts. When I have a seizure, I can't control my body. I've broken things, injured myself. Once I fell against a stove and—" She pushed up her sleeve slightly, revealing a burn scar on her forearm. "People have reason to be afraid." "They have reason to be cautious, not afraid," Wade corrected. "And caution can be taught. Understanding can be learned." He leaned forward. "Let me help you, Grace. At least give Willow Creek a chance before you decide to move on." Grace studied him with those perceptive hazel eyes. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Wade considered his answer carefully. "Maybe because I'm tired of this town treating differences like threats. Maybe because I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control." He smiled slightly. "Or maybe because I'd like the chance to know you better, and you can't do that if you're always running." A faint blush colored her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I can't promise to stay, but I suppose I could give it a week." "A week it is," Wade agreed, feeling an unexpected surge of hope. "Now, shall we go see Mrs. Whitfield about that seamstress position?" Mrs. Whitfield's dress shop sat between the general store and the barber shop on Willow Creek's Main Street, its large front window displaying a fashionable gown that had likely been copied from a Harper's Bazaar illustration. The bell above the door jingled as Wade and Grace entered, announcing their presence to the gray-haired woman bent over a ledger at the counter. Esther Whitfield peered at them over her spectacles, recognition dawning as she spotted Wade. "Well now, Wade Young, I never thought I'd see the day you willingly entered a dress shop." Her gaze shifted to Grace, curious but not unkind. "And who might this be?" Wade removed his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Whitfield, This is Miss Grace Jenkins. She's new in town and happens to be an accomplished seamstress looking for work. Mrs. Whitfield's expression brightened instantly. Is that so? Well, isn't that providential? My hands aren't as nimble as they once were, especially for fine work. She gestured for Grace to come closer. Do you have experience with evening wear, my dear? That's most of what I do these days, dresses for socials and the occasional wedding gown. Grace stepped forward confidently. Yes, madam. I apprenticed with a dressmaker in Boston for 3 years before moving west. I'm particularly skilled with embroidery and beadwork. Boston! Mrs. Whitfield exclaimed, clearly impressed. Well, you must show me your work. I have a commission that's been giving me fits a dinner dress for Mrs. Mayor Henderson with the tiniest pearl buttons you've ever seen. My eyes crossed just looking at them. Wade watched as Grace's shoulders relaxed slightly. This was her element, and despite her condition, she knew her worth here. He cleared his throat. There is something you should know, Mrs. Whitfield, and I think it's better coming from us directly rather than through town gossip. Grace shot him a panicked look, but Wade gave a reassuring nod. Better to be forthright than to have Mrs. Whitfield hear exaggerated tales later. Miss Jenkins has a medical condition called epilepsy, Wade explained carefully. It causes her to have occasional seizures. They pass quickly, and she recovers fully, but it can be alarming to witness if you're not prepared. Mrs. Whitfield's expression turned guarded. Seizures? You mean like fits? My cousin's boy had those, thought he was possessed until the doctor explained it was a brain fever he'd had as an infant. It's similar, Grace said quietly, but I've had it since childhood. It's not contagious, and I often can tell when an episode is coming on. The older woman frowned thoughtfully. Well, I don't suppose it matters much as long as you keep your stitches straight. But what happens if you have one of these episodes? While working, I can't afford damaged materials. I understand your concern, Grace replied. If I feel one coming, I can set aside my work. And I'm willing to pay for any damages that might occur. Mrs. Whitfield considered this for a long moment while Wade held his breath. Finally, she nodded decisively. 2 weeks trial. We'll see how it goes. I can pay 50 cents a day to start. More if you prove your worth. Relief washed over Grace's face. Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. You won't regret it. See that I don't? The older woman replied, but there was a kindness in her eyes that gave Wade hope. Can you start tomorrow morning at 8? Yes, madam. I'll be here. As they left the shop, Grace turned to Wade, a genuine smile lighting her features. Thank you for being honest with her, for speaking up for me. Most people wouldn't have done that. Most people don't know what they're missing by not giving others a chance, Wade replied. Now, how about I show you around town? Willow Creek isn't large, but it has its charms. They spent the afternoon wandering through Willow Creek, Wade pointing out the various businesses and introducing Grace to people they encountered. Some were openly curious about the new arrival, others more reserved, but no one was outright hostile. By the time they reached the small church at the edge of town, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It's beautiful here, Grace admitted, gazing out over the rolling hills that surrounded the valley where Willow Creek nestled. Different from anywhere else I've been. California has a way of getting under your skin, Wade agreed. Been here 7 years now and can't imagine living anywhere else. They walked back toward the hotel in comfortable silence as twilight descended. When they reached the hotel's porch, Grace turned to him. Why did you really help me yesterday, Wade? The truth this time. Wade looked into her eyes, considering his answer. My younger sister had epilepsy, he said finally. Emily. She died during the war. Typhoid took her, not the seizures. But I remember how people treated her. How they feared what they didn't understand. When I saw you yesterday, I thought about how Emily never had anyone but family to stand up for her. Grace's expression softened. I'm sorry about your sister. It was a long time ago, Wade said, though the ache never truly left. But it taught me something important. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they are, not just for the challenges they face. That's a rare perspective, especially out here where survival often depends on quick judgments. Maybe, Wade smiled slightly, or maybe I just recognized something in you worth knowing better. A blush colored her cheeks again, visible even in the fading light. Good night, Wade, and thank you again. Good night, Grace. I'll check on you tomorrow after work. As he rode back to his cabin that night, Wade wondered at the strange twist of fate that had brought Grace Jenkins to Willow Creek. One thing was certain: his life had just become considerably more interesting. Grace's first day at Mrs. Whitfield's shop went smoothly. The older woman was clearly impressed with Grace's skillful stitching and creative suggestions for the mayor's wife's gown. By noon, Mrs. Whitfield was treating Grace as if she'd worked there for years, showing her the pattern books and discussing upcoming commissions with growing enthusiasm. Wade finished his ranch chores early again and headed into town, telling himself it was merely to check on Grace's progress. The truth, which he was reluctant to admit even to himself, was that he simply wanted to see her again. There was something about her quiet determination that drew him like a moth to flame. As he approached the dress shop, he heard raised voices inside. His pace quickened, and he pushed open the door to find Grace standing rigidly behind the counter facing Abigail Henderson, the mayor's wife, whose expression could have curdled fresh milk. I simply cannot have a person of your condition working on my gown, Mrs. Henderson was saying imperiously. What if you had one of your fits while handling the silk? It's imported from France, I'll have you know. Grace's face was pale but composed. I understand your concern, Mrs. Henderson, but I assure you, you can assure me of nothing. The woman interrupted. My husband is the mayor, and I cannot be associated with such irregularities. Mrs. Whitfield, I insist you dismiss this woman immediately, or I shall take my business to Sacramento. Wade stepped forward, touching the brim of his hat politely. Afternoon, ladies. Mrs. Henderson turned, her expression shifting to a practiced smile. Mr. Young, how fortuitous. Perhaps you can make Mrs. Whitfield see reason. This person she's hired is subject to demonic fits. Surely you understand the danger. Actually, Mrs. Henderson, Wade said calmly, Miss Jenkins has epilepsy, which is a medical condition, not a demonic possession, and she happens to be the finest seamstress between here and San Francisco, according to Mrs. Whitfield. That's correct, Mrs. Whitfield interjected, emerging from the back room. Her normally accommodating demeanor had been replaced by a steely resolve that surprised Wade. Miss Jenkins has already done more precise work this morning than my arthritic hands could manage in a week. If you prefer to take your business elsewhere, that is certainly your right, but I stand by my decision to hire her. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed several times, clearly unprepared for resistance. Well, I never. Mayor Henderson will hear about this. I'm sure he will, Mrs. Whitfield replied dryly. Would you like me to continue with your gown, or shall I return your deposit? The mayor's wife hesitated, her desire for the fashionable gown clearly at war with her prejudice. Finally, vanity won out. Continue the work, but I want your personal guarantee that this woman won't damage the fabric. The work will be perfect or you'll pay nothing, Mrs. Whitfield assured her. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have other customers to attend to. After Mrs. Henderson had swept out of the shop in a huff, Grace turned to Mrs. Whitfield with wide eyes. You didn't have to defend me. I wouldn't want to cost you business. Nonsense. The older woman snorted. Abigail Henderson needs me far more than I need her. Besides, she'll change her tune once she sees your work." She glanced at Wade with a knowing smile. "Thank you for your support, Mr. Young, though I had the situation well in hand." "Never doubted it for a moment, Mrs. Whitfield," Wade replied with a grin. After Mrs. Whitfield returned to her cutting table, Grace moved closer to Wade. "You didn't have to come to my rescue either," she said softly, though her eyes conveyed gratitude. "Wasn't a rescue," Wade countered. "More of a reinforcement. You were holding your own just fine." A small smile curved her lips. "It's still nice not to stand alone for once." Something in her words made Wade's chest tighten. "You're not alone in Willow Creek, Grace. Not anymore." The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant routine. Grace continued working at Mrs. Whitfield's shop, impressing customers with her skilled craftsmanship. Word of her talent spread, and soon women were specifically requesting her work, her medical condition becoming secondary to her abilities with needle and thread. Wade found reasons to visit town nearly every day, supplies he suddenly needed, errands he'd forgotten, social calls he rarely made before. Each time, his path would somehow lead to the dress shop, where he'd tip his hat to Mrs. Whitfield and engage Grace in conversation about her day. They began taking supper together at the hotel restaurant several evenings a week. Wade learned that Grace was 28, born and raised in Massachusetts, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a carpenter. Her mother had died when Grace was 16, and her father had passed away 3 years ago, leaving her truly alone in the world. Her seizures had begun when she was 10, after a fall from a tree left her unconscious for 2 days. "The doctors said I might outgrow it," she told Wade as they shared apple pie one evening. "But it only got worse as I got older. My father protected me as best he could, but after he died." She shrugged. "People don't want to hire someone who might collapse at any moment." "Their loss," Wade said firmly. "Mrs. Whitfield says you're the best assistant she's ever had." Grace smiled, though sadness lingered in her eyes. "It's only been a month, Wade. Something will happen eventually. It always does." Wade reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Not this time," he promised. "This time is different." And for a while it seemed he might be right. Grace had 2 seizures during her first 6 weeks in Willow Creek, one at the hotel when she was alone, and one at the dress shop when only Mrs. Whitfield was present. The older woman had calmly followed Wade's instructions. Clear away sharp objects, cushion Grace's head, and wait for the seizure to pass. When Grace regained consciousness, Mrs. Whitfield had simply helped her to a chair, brought her some water, and returned to work as if nothing extraordinary had happened. As summer deepened, Wade invited Grace to his ranch for Sunday dinner. It was the first time she'd ventured beyond the town's boundaries since her arrival, and her delight in the rolling landscape, the sturdy cabin Wade had built with his own hands, and the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance was evident. "It's wonderful," she told him as they sat on his porch after the meal, watching the sunset paint the hills gold. "So peaceful." "Peaceful most days," Wade agreed, "though cattle have their moments of stubbornness that test a man's patience." Grace laughed, a sound that had become precious to Wade. "Rather like customers at the dress shop." Wade turned to look at her, taking in the way the evening light softened her features, highlighting the auburn tints in her chestnut hair. In that moment, he realized with startling clarity that he'd fallen in love with Grace Jenkins, her strength, her resilience, her quiet dignity in the face of hardship. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. "What?" Grace asked, noticing his intent gaze. "Just thinking how glad I am that stagecoach brought you to Willow Creek," he replied honestly. A soft blush colored her cheeks. "Even though I've been nothing but trouble?" "You've been anything but trouble, Grace Jenkins." His voice grew serious. "You've brought something to this town it didn't even know it was missing." "And what's that?" "Grace," he answered simply, enjoying the double meaning. Then, before he could lose his nerve, he added, I'd like to court you properly if you'd allow it. Her eyes widened, a mixture of hope and fear crossing her face. Wade, you know what I am, what could happen? I know exactly who you are, he interrupted gently. A strong, talented woman who doesn't let her challenges define her. The seizures are part of you, but they're not all of you. Tears welled in her eyes. No one has ever seen me that way before. Then everyone else has been blind, Wade replied, reaching for her hand. So, Miss Jenkins, what do you say? Will you allow me to court you? Grace hesitated only a moment before twining her fingers with his. Yes, Mr. Young, I believe I will. Their courtship progressed through the golden California summer and into the crisp days of autumn. Wade brought Grace wildflowers and books borrowed from the minister's extensive library. Grace knitted Wade a scarf in the evenings, working by lamplight in her hotel room after long days at the dress shop. They took Sunday rides into the countryside, picnicked by the creek that gave the town its name, and gradually, Grace began to believe that perhaps Willow Creek could become her home. Mrs. Whitfield, seeing the way the wind was blowing, took Grace aside one October afternoon. You know, my dear, my late husband built a small cottage behind the shop when we first came to Willow Creek. I've been using it for storage since his passing, but with a little cleaning, it could make a fine living quarters for a young woman who might prefer her independence to hotel living. Grace was touched by the offer. Are you certain? I wouldn't want to impose. Impose? Child, you've doubled my business since you arrived. The ladies of this town may have initially come to gawk at the woman with the falling sickness, but they keep coming back because of your skill with a needle. Besides, she added with a twinkle in her eye, it's not proper for a young woman being courted to live indefinitely in a hotel. People will talk. The cottage was indeed small, just 2 rooms with a tiny kitchen alcove, but to Grace, who had been living out of carpetbags for 3 years, it was perfect. Wade helped her move her few belongings and spent several days making repairs to the roof and chimney while Grace cleaned years of dust from the windows and floors. By the end of October, she was settled in her new home, reveling in the simple pleasure of having a space that was truly hers. November brought the first significant rainfall of the season. The dusty streets of Willow Creek turned to mud, and the creek swelled with runoff from the surrounding hills. Wade worried about Grace walking to and from the shop in the increasingly inclement weather, knowing that getting chilled and overtired could sometimes trigger her seizures. You should stay with Mrs. Whitfield when the weather's bad, he suggested one evening as they huddled by the fire in her cottage, listening to rain pound against the roof. I'm not made of sugar, Wade, Grace replied with a smile. I won't melt in the rain. No, but you might catch cold, and then where would we be? His concern was genuine. At least let me drive you to and from the shop on the worst days. Grace's expression softened. Always trying to keep me safe, aren't you? Someone should, Wade answered simply. She leaned over and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek, their first such intimacy. Thank you for caring. Wade's heart raced at the innocent gesture. He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. I more than care, Grace. I love you. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Grace's eyes widened, and for a moment, Wade feared he'd spoken too soon. But then her face transformed with joy, like the sun breaking through storm clouds. I love you too, she whispered, though heaven knows I've tried not to. I told myself it wasn't fair to you, that my condition would only bring you heartache. Wade shook his head firmly. The only heartache would be living without you, now that I've found you. He squeezed her hand gently. Your epilepsy is just one part of who you are, Grace, like my stubbornness or Mrs. Whitfield's arthritis. It doesn't define you, and it certainly doesn't change how I feel. Grace's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I've dreamed of hearing someone say those words to me, but I never truly believed I would. Wade brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. Believe it now, he murmured, leaning forward to press his lips softly against hers. The kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a demand, but it sealed something between them, a commitment that transcended the challenges they might face. When they finally parted, both were smiling. "Marry me, Grace," Wade said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could consider their wisdom. "Not right away if you're not ready, but someday. I want to build a life with you." Grace drew in a sharp breath. "Wade, marriage is complicated for someone like me. What about children? Epilepsy can be inherited. And what happens when I have seizures? What if I can't be the kind of wife you deserve?" "First of all," Wade said, his tone gentle but firm, "there's no someone like you. There's just you, Grace Jenkins, the woman I love. Second, we'll face whatever comes together, be it seizures or children or anything else life throws our way." He smiled slightly. "I'm not proposing because I think it will be easy. I'm proposing because I want to walk through all of it, the hard and the easy, with you by my side." Grace studied his face, searching for any hint of uncertainty and finding none. "You're certain? Truly certain? More certain than I've ever been about anything," Wade affirmed. A slow smile spread across Grace's face, transforming it with a radiance that took Wade's breath away. "Then yes, Wade Young, I will marry you. Not because you're the first man who's seen past my epilepsy, but because you're the only man I've ever loved enough to share my life with." Wade gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, because to him, she was. They decided to marry in the spring, when the hills around Willow Creek would be carpeted with wildflowers. The announcement of their engagement caused a minor stir in the small town, but less than Wade had feared. Grace had become a respected member of the community through her work and quiet dignity. Even Mayor Henderson, whose wife now proudly wore dresses made exclusively by Grace, offered his congratulations. December brought an unexpected cold snap and the first snow that many in Willow Creek could remember. The entire town seemed to hold its breath in wonder as fat flakes drifted from a leaden sky, coating the dusty streets and wooden buildings in pristine white. Children, many of whom had never seen snow before, raced through the streets shrieking with delight. Grace watched from the dress shop window, her expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. "It's beautiful," she told Mrs. Whitfield, "but I hope it doesn't last long. Snow makes everything more difficult." "California snow rarely lingers," the older woman assured her. "By this time tomorrow it will likely be gone." But Mrs. Whitfield was wrong. The snow continued to fall throughout the day and into the night, accumulating to nearly a foot by morning, an extraordinary amount for the region. The temperature dropped further, freezing the snow into a crusty layer that made walking treacherous. Wade arrived at the dress shop just before closing, concern etched on his features. "The weather's turning bad fast," he told Grace and Mrs. Whitfield. "There's talk of a proper blizzard moving in. I think we should close up now and get you both home before it hits." Mrs. Whitfield looked skeptical. "A blizzard? In Willow Creek? Nonsense. The Cowboys coming in from the north say it's the worst storm they've seen in years," Wade insisted. "Already caused damage up in the high country." Grace, who had lived through New England winters, recognized the seriousness in Wade's tone. "We should listen to him, Mrs. Whitfield. Better safe than sorry." They secured the shop and Wade escorted them through the increasingly heavy snowfall to their respective homes. Mrs. Whitfield lived just a block away in rooms above the barber shop, but Grace's cottage, though directly behind the dress shop, was accessed through a narrow alley that was already drifting with snow. "I don't like leaving you here alone," Wade said as they stamped snow from their boots inside Grace's tiny home. "If the storm gets worse, you could be snowed in." I have plenty of firewood and food, Grace assured him, though she shared his concern. The cottage suddenly seemed very small and vulnerable against the growing storm. I'll be fine. Wade looked unconvinced. I could sleep in the chair. That wouldn't be proper, and you know it, Grace interrupted with a small smile. We're not married yet, Wade young. Propriety be damned when safety's at stake, he muttered, though he knew she was right. Willow Creek was a small town with traditional values, and Grace's reputation mattered. In the end, they compromised. Wade would return to his ranch but come back first thing in the morning to check on her. If the snow's too deep to ride, I'll walk, he promised. Just keep the fire going and stay warm. Grace stood on tiptoe to kiss him goodbye. I will. Now go before the trail becomes impassable. Wade made it back to his ranch just as the storm hit full force. Wind howled around the cabin, driving snow against the windows with such violence that it sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. He thought of Grace in her tiny cottage and cursed himself for not insisting she come with him. Propriety be damned. Sleep eluded him as the storm raged. Around midnight, a particularly strong gust shook the cabin, and Wade heard an ominous crack followed by a crash from the barn. Grabbing his coat and a lantern, he fought his way through snow already knee-deep to discover that part of the barn roof had collapsed under the weight of wet snow. The horses were panicking, and it took Wade hours to calm them and move them to the undamaged section of the barn. By the time he had made temporary repairs to protect against the driving snow, dawn was breaking, though the sky remained so dark with storm clouds that little light penetrated. Wade knew he needed to get to Grace, but the snow was now thigh-deep in places, and the wind was still dangerously strong. His horse couldn't possibly make it through the drifts to town. He would have to walk, but first he needed to secure the farm and change into dry clothes. Meanwhile, Grace had spent a restless night listening to the storm rage around her small cottage. The wind found every crack and crevice in the old building, sending drafts skittering across the floor despite her best efforts to block them. She maintained the fire as Wade had instructed, but by morning, her woodpile was dangerously depleted. As daylight slowly filtered through the snow-covered windows, Grace assessed her situation. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind seemed to be growing stronger, howling down the chimney and causing smoke to back up into the room. She could go to Mrs. Whitfield's rooms, but that would mean fighting her way through the alley, which was likely drifted with snow higher than her head in places. Her best option was to stay put and conserve her resources. She had enough food for several days if she was careful, and she could melt snow for water if necessary. The wood was her biggest concern. Without it, the temperature in the cottage would quickly drop to dangerous levels. Grace was contemplating whether she could safely burn some of the wooden storage crates in the corner when a wave of familiar dizziness washed over her. No, not now, she thought desperately. Not during the storm. But her body paid no heed to her wishes. The aura, that strange, detached sensation that often preceded her seizures, intensified. She barely had time to move away from the stove before the convulsions began. When she regained consciousness, Grace was lying on the floor near the front door. How long she had been unconscious, she couldn't tell, but the fire had died down to embers, and the cottage was significantly colder. As she struggled to sit up, she became aware of a sharp pain in her left wrist. Looking down, she saw it was swollen and beginning to bruise, sprained or possibly broken during the seizure. With her good hand, Grace managed to add the last few pieces of wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life. But now she faced a terrible dilemma. With her injured wrist, venturing out to Mrs. Whitfield's through the deep snow would be even more dangerous. Yet staying meant facing the cold once the last of her would burned out. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, Grace felt truly afraid. Not of the seizures, those were an old, familiar enemy, but of dying alone in the storm, of never seeing Wade again, of having her chance at happiness snatched away just when it seemed within reach. No, she decided firmly. She hadn't survived years of hardship and prejudice to die in a snowstorm. Wade would come for her as soon as he could. Her job was to stay alive until he did. Wade set out for town shortly after dawn, battling through snowdrifts that sometimes reached his waist. The 3-mile journey that normally took less than an hour on horseback stretched into an exhausting ordeal that tested every ounce of his determination. The wind cut through his clothing despite the layers, and snow caked his beard and eyebrows, freezing his eyelashes together. By the time he reached the outskirts of Willow Creek, Wade was dangerously cold and growing disoriented, early signs of hypothermia that the rational part of his mind recognized even as he pushed forward. The town was eerily quiet, most residents wisely staying inside where it was warm and safe. Wade made his way directly to Grace's cottage, alarm surging through him when he saw no smoke rising from the chimney. Using his shoulder, he rammed against the door, which had frozen shut in the intense cold. It gave way on the third attempt, sending him sprawling onto the floor of the cottage. The interior was frighteningly cold, only marginally warmer than the outside air. In the dim light filtering through the snow-covered windows, Wade saw Grace huddled on her bed, wrapped in every blanket she owned, her face pale with cold. "Grace!" He stumbled to her side, his numb fingers fumbling to find a pulse in her neck. It was there, slow but steady. Her eyes fluttered open at his touch. "Wade!" she whispered through blue-tinged lips. "You came." "Of course I came," he replied, gathering her into his arms. "I promised, didn't I?" He felt her shivering violently against him, a good sign. Actually, it meant her body was still fighting the cold. "What happened to the fire?" "Ran out of wood," Grace managed through chattering teeth. "Had a seizure. Hurt my wrist. Couldn't go for help." Wade's heart clenched at the thought of her alone, injured, and freezing. "We need to get you warm." He glanced around the cottage, assessing their options. "Can you walk? We need to get to Mrs. Whitfield's or the hotel." Grace nodded weakly. "I think so, with help." Wade wrapped her in another layer, his own coat, and helped her to her feet. Her injured wrist was cradled against her chest, and he could see the pain in her eyes as she moved. "Lean on me," he instructed, putting his arm around her waist. Small steps. They made it to the door, but one look outside made Wade reconsider. The storm had intensified again, visibility reduced to mere feet. Attempting to navigate even the short distance to Mrs. Whitfield's would be risking both their lives. "Change of plans," he said, turning back. "We're staying put." He guided Grace back to the bed. "Keep those blankets tight around you. I'm going to see what I can find to burn." The cottage offered meager options: some wooden crates, a small side table, and a broken chair that Mrs. Whitfield had left behind. Wade broke them apart methodically, creating a pile of burnable wood. It wouldn't last long, but it might be enough to get them through the worst of the storm. As the fire sputtered back to life, Wade turned his attention to Grace's injured wrist. It was definitely sprained, possibly fractured. Using strips torn from a spare petticoat, he fashioned a crude sling to immobilize it. "Thank you," Grace murmured as he worked. "I was beginning to think." "Don't," Wade interrupted gently. "Don't think about what might have happened. I'm here now, and we'll weather this storm together." Grace managed a small smile despite her pain and exhaustion. "Like you said we would." "Exactly like I said." Wade settled beside her on the bed, pulling the blankets around them both to share body heat. "We'll get through this, and every storm that comes our way, for the rest of our lives." The blizzard raged for another full day before finally beginning to abate. Wade maintained the fire as best he could with their limited fuel, even resorting to burning a shelf and the wooden frame of a small mirror. They melted snow for water and shared the meager supplies Grace had on hand: some dried apples, hard biscuits, and a jar of preserved peaches that became a feast in their hungry state. Throughout those long hours, they talked about everything and nothing: their childhoods, their dreams for the future, the home they would build together on Wade's land. Grace's seizure had left her weakened, but as warmth and nourishment gradually returned, so did her strength and spirit. "When we're married," Wade said as they watched the fire's flickering light cast shadows on the wall, "I want to build a proper house. Nothing fancy, but solid, with extra insulation against the cold, and a stone hearth big enough to warm the whole main room." Grace leaned against his shoulder. "I'd like that. And perhaps a small garden? I've always wanted to grow flowers and vegetables." "As big a garden as you want," Wade promised. "The soil's good by the creek. Things grow well there in summer." "And children?" Grace asked softly, giving voice to the question that had hovered between them. "Do you want them, despite the risk?" Wade turned to face her, his expression serious. "I want whatever life brings us, Grace. If that includes children, I'll be grateful. If not, having you as my wife will be more than enough blessing for one man." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "How did I find you?" "I like to think we found each other," Wade replied, brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Or maybe it was fate that put you on that stagecoach to Willow Creek." "Fate or luck or God's hand," Grace murmured. "I'm just thankful it happened." When the storm finally cleared on the third day, the world outside had been transformed. Drifts of snow hugged the buildings of Willow Creek, some reaching to the eaves. The sky was a brilliant, almost painful blue, and sunlight reflected off the snow with diamond brightness. Neighbors emerged to check on one another, shoveling paths between buildings and sharing supplies. Wade and Grace, their absence noted, were soon found by a search party led by the sheriff and Mrs. Whitfield, who had been frantic with worry. The town doctor examined Grace's wrist, declaring it badly sprained but not broken. "It will heal," he assured her, "though you'll need to rest it for at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks without sewing?" Grace looked dismayed. 2 weeks of being pampered," Wade corrected with a smile. "Starting now." Despite Mrs. Whitfield's protests that it wasn't proper, Wade insisted on staying in town to care for Grace until she recovered. He took a room at the hotel but spent his days at the cottage, repairing the damage from the storm, building up a proper woodpile, and making sure Grace didn't overexert herself. The experience of the blizzard, their first true crisis, weathered together, deepened their bond in ways neither had anticipated. The town, too, seemed to rally around them. Those who had been skeptical of Grace's condition or Wade's choice to court her now saw the devotion between them and found it harder to judge. Even Mrs. Henderson, bringing a basket of food from the Ladies' Aid Society, admitted grudgingly, "You seem to have found a good man, Miss Jenkins. One who stands by his promises." "The best man," Grace agreed simply. As January turned to February, and February began to soften toward March, wedding plans progressed. Mrs. Whitfield and the other ladies of the town took charge, determined that the first wedding of the spring would be a celebration to remember. The dress shop hummed with activity as Grace, her wrist finally healed, worked on her own wedding gown, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk with delicate embroidery along the bodice and hem. Wade, meanwhile, focused on completing their home. With help from neighbors and friends, the small cabin on his property was expanded to include a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, and the stone hearth he had promised Grace. He built sturdy furniture from local pine and oak, including a rocking chair for the porch where they could watch the sunset together. As the wedding day approached, Grace experienced another seizure, her first since the blizzard. It happened at the dress shop, but this time no one panicked. Mrs. Whitfield calmly followed the procedures Wade had taught her, ensuring Grace was safe until the episode passed. When Grace regained consciousness, embarrassed and apologetic. She found not fear or disgust in the faces around her, but concern and acceptance. "No need for apologies," Mrs. Whitfield said firmly. "We all have our crosses to bear. Yours just happens to be more visible at times." Grace looked around at the women who had gathered to help with wedding preparations, women who now looked at her with understanding rather than suspicion or pity. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly accepted for who she was, epilepsy and all. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. The day of the wedding dawned clear and mild, the hills around Willow Creek bursting with early spring wildflowers just as Wade and Grace had hoped. The small church was filled to capacity, the entire town turning out to witness the union of the rancher and the seamstress whose love story had captivated them all. Grace wore her ivory silk gown, her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant chignon adorned with tiny white flowers. As she walked down the aisle on the arm of Sheriff Davis, who had offered to stand in place of her father, her eyes were fixed on Wade, standing tall and proud at the altar. Wade, for his part, couldn't take his eyes off his bride. The memory of their first meeting, Grace collapsed on the boardwalk, vulnerable and alone, contrasted sharply with the confident woman approaching him now, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had come to respect and admire her. Their vows were simple but profound. When they reached the traditional words, "in sickness and in health," Wade squeezed Grace's hands meaningfully, his eyes conveying what words could not: his absolute commitment to stand by her through every seizure, every challenge, every storm life might bring. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Wade kissed his bride, the church erupted in cheers and applause. Whatever doubts or whispers had once circulated about the wisdom of their match were silenced in that moment of pure joy. The celebration continued at the town hall, transformed with spring flowers and ribbons into a festive space where the entire community gathered to feast and dance. Wade and Grace led the first dance, moving together as if they'd been partners all their lives. When Grace, tired, still building her stamina after the ordeal of the blizzard, Wade guided her to a quiet corner where they could observe the festivities. "Happy, Mrs. Young?" he asked, the new name still sounding wonderful to his ears. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Grace replied, leaning against his shoulder. "I still can't quite believe this is real, that I found a home, a community that accepts me, a husband who loves me despite everything." "Not despite, Grace," Wade corrected gently. "Your strength in facing your challenges is part of why I love you. I admire your courage every day." As twilight fell, Wade and Grace slipped away from the celebration, boarding the decorated wagon that would take them to their new home. Friends and well-wishers followed for a short distance, showering them with flower petals and good-natured teasing before turning back to allow the newlyweds their privacy. The house Wade had prepared was lit with lanterns, casting a golden glow across the porch where the promised rocking chair waited. Inside, every detail reflected his care and consideration, from the extra thick rugs that would cushion any fall to the specially designed stove with safety features to prevent burns if Grace should have a seizure while cooking. "It's perfect," Grace whispered as Wade carried her across the threshold. "Everything I could have wanted." "There's one more thing," Wade said, leading her to the bedroom. There, beside the bed, was a small bell attached to a cord that ran through a hole in the wall. "It connects to the bunkhouse where the ranch hands stay," he explained. "If you ever need help when I'm out working, if you feel a seizure coming or for any other reason, just pull the cord. Someone will come running." Tears filled Grace's eyes at this tangible proof of Wade's understanding. "You've thought of everything." "I try," he said simply, drawing her into his arms. "I want you to feel safe here, Grace. Safe and loved always." Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons. Spring brought new calves to the ranch and a steady stream of customers to Mrs. Whitfield's shop, where Grace continued to work 3 days a week. Summer filled their garden with vegetables and flowers, just as Grace had hoped. Fall painted the surrounding hills in russet and gold, and winter milder than the previous year found them snug in their home, planning for the future. Grace's seizures continued, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes clustering in a way that left her exhausted and frustrated. But true to his promise, Wade learned to anticipate them, to recognize the subtle signs that preceded an episode, and to keep her safe through each one. The town doctor, initially skeptical about managing epilepsy, became interested in Grace's condition and began corresponding with specialists in San Francisco. Through this exchange, he learned of new treatments being developed, bromide salts that showed promise in reducing the frequency and severity of seizures in some patients. "It's not a cure," he cautioned when he discussed the treatment with Grace and Wade, "and there can be side effects, but it might help make the episodes more manageable." Grace decided to try the medication. The first few weeks were difficult as her body adjusted to the bromides, but gradually, they began to see improvement. The seizures didn't stop completely, but they became less frequent and less severe, a blessing Grace hadn't dared hope for. A year after their wedding, Grace discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought both joy and trepidation. The doctor says the pregnancy might temporarily affect the seizures for better or worse. He's not sure, she told Wade one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. And there's still the risk the baby might inherit the condition. Wade covered her hand with his. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together, just like we promised." The pregnancy progressed well, with only 2 mild seizures during the entire 9 months. Grace continued taking a reduced dose of bromides under the doctor's supervision, balancing the need to control her epilepsy against potential risks to the baby. Their son, William Thomas Young, was born on a crisp October day in 1877, healthy and strong with a shock of dark hair like his father's and eyes that would eventually settle into the same hazel as his mother's. Wade, who had faced cattle rustlers and blizzards without flinching, wept openly when the midwife placed his son in his arms. "He's perfect," Wade whispered, sitting beside Grace on the bed they had shared for over a year. "Just like his mother." Grace smiled tiredly, reaching out to touch their son's tiny hand. "Not perfect," she corrected gently, "but loved. So very loved." As William grew from infant to toddler, showing no signs of epilepsy, Grace allowed herself to hope that he had been spared her condition. Wade built a sturdy playpen that doubled as a safe space when Grace felt a seizure approaching, ensuring that both mother and child were protected during episodes. The community that had come to embrace Grace now extended that acceptance to her role as a mother. Mrs. Whitfield, now officially retired but still a frequent visitor to the dress shop, doted on young William as if he were her own grandson. Even Mrs. Henderson, whose initial prejudice had given way to grudging respect and eventually genuine friendship, brought hand-knitted baby clothes and offered to watch William when Grace worked at the shop. 3 years after William's birth, the young family welcomed a daughter, Emily Rose, named for Wade's sister and Grace's mother. Unlike her brother, Emily's arrival was complicated by a prolonged seizure that sent Grace into early labor. For several harrowing hours, Wade feared he might lose both his wife and unborn child. But Grace's strength prevailed once again, and though Emily was small at birth, she was otherwise healthy and grew quickly under her parents' devoted care. As the children grew, Wade and Grace were open with them about their mother's condition. They learned early how to recognize the signs of an approaching seizure and what to do when one occurred. William, serious and protective from a young age, took his role as his mother's helper very seriously. Emily, more carefree but equally compassionate, developed an uncanny ability to sense when her mother needed rest or quiet to prevent an episode. The ranch prospered under Wade's careful management, expanding to include more cattle and several fine horses. Grace's reputation as a seamstress continued to grow, with commissions coming from as far away as San Francisco after the wife of a visiting businessman wore one of her gowns to a society event. Life wasn't without its challenges. Grace's seizures never disappeared completely, though the bromides continued to help manage them. There were still occasional whispers from newcomers to town who didn't understand her condition. William faced teasing at school when a classmate witnessed Grace having a seizure in the Mercantile and spread exaggerated tales of Mrs. Young's fits. But for every challenge, there seemed to be a greater blessing. The same classmate who had teased William later fell from a horse and began having seizures himself. Instead of shunning the boy, William became his steadfast defender, using the knowledge he'd gained from his mother's experience to help his former tormentor adjust. When a fire threatened the dress shop and several other businesses on Main Street in 1885, it was Grace who organized the Bucket Brigade, her calm efficiency in crisis earning newfound respect from those who had previously seen only her vulnerability. And through it all, Wade remained her constant, her anchor, the man who had seen beyond her epilepsy to the woman she truly was. Each night, as they lay together in the bed he had built with his own hands, he would hold her close and whisper, "Another day weathered together." "Another storm survived," she would reply, their private ritual a reminder of that first blizzard and all they had overcome since. 10 years after their wedding, on a spring day much like the one when they had exchanged vows, Wade surprised Grace with a gift, a small, silver-framed daguerreotype of their family. Wade standing tall and proud, Grace seated before him with Emily on her lap, and William standing straight beside his father, all dressed in their Sunday best. "For the mantle," Wade explained, "so we never forget how far we've come." Grace traced the images lovingly. "From a fallen woman on a boardwalk to this," she marveled. "I never imagined such happiness could be mine." "You never just fell, Grace," Wade corrected gently, the same words he'd been saying for years. "You rose. You've been rising every day since I met you, teaching all of us what true strength looks like." As twilight deepened into night, they sat together on the porch in the rocking chair that had weathered as many seasons as their love. The lights of their home glowed behind them, their children safely asleep in beds beneath handmade quilts. Before them stretched the land they had tamed together, and beyond that, the limitless sky where stars were beginning to appear one by one. "I'm not dangerous," Grace said softly, breaking a comfortable silence. "That's what I told you that first day, that I was dangerous. But you never believed it." Wade took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become second nature over the years. "Because it was never true," he replied simply. "You were always just Grace brave, beautiful Grace who needed someone to weather the storms with her." "And you did?" she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Every single one." The night settled around them like a comfortable blanket, secure in the knowledge that whatever storms might come, they would face them as they had always done together, with love as their shelter and each other as their home.